Good morning, my dear students. Welcome to another class on linguistics. So, these past few weeks, we have been dealing with some models of grammar to get us a better understanding of the structure of English language. So, we have been analyzing some sentences using IC analysis, phrase structure grammar, etc. Now, it's time for us to go to another step, a further step, that is transformational generative grammar. So, the model of grammar we are going to learn today is called Transformational Generative Grammar. So, as the name suggests, it has two components, transformational component and generative component. Let us look into transformational generative grammar, hereafter called as TG grammar. So, transformational generative grammar, it had its first exponent in Noam Chomsky. So, he is the name behind TG grammar. He is a very famous American linguist, and we have already discussed some concepts by Noam Chomsky in our earlier lessons. So, he has written two books in which TG grammar figure. These books are Syntactic Structures, which he wrote in 1957, and Aspects of the Theory of Syntax in 1965. In these two books, what Noam Chomsky tries to do is he tries to answer many questions which were left unanswered by the structuralists. Now, all these other models of grammar that we already learned, like IC analysis, it is a structuralist tool. It is a tool used by structural grammarians to analyze the structure of a sentence. Also, phrase structure grammar. Phrase structure grammar is a model of grammar used by structural grammarians. But there were a lot of problems with these two, with IC analysis and PSG. There were a lot of limitations like ambiguity. These two models were not able to explain certain ambiguities in certain sentences, and that is where Noam Chomsky comes in with transformational generative grammar, and he tries to answer these questions left unanswered by the structuralists. So, before we move on to discuss transformational generative grammar, I would like to discuss the inadequacies of the models of grammar by structural grammarians, or the inadequacies of structuralism in linguistics. The first point is that structuralism is corpus bound. Corpus means a body or a mass of work or data. So, what happens in structuralism is there will be a given data, and this data is analyzed using inductive methods by structuralists. They will already have a theory in mind, a formula, and using this formula, the data is analyzed. For example, in PSG, what we did was we already had a formula, what is NP and what is VP and all. So we just rewrote the structure of the sentence using these inductive methods. But Noam Chomsky takes another approach. Instead of using inductive methods, he has a deductive approach. And using this deductive approach, he tries to build a theoretical account of grammar. What he does is, he doesn't know the theory or formula at first. All he has is the data. And by analyzing this data, he tries to arrive at the formula or theory. അപ്പോൾ ആദ്യം തന്നെ തിയറി കൊടുത്തിട്ടില്ല. ഇപ്പം നോം ചോംസ്കി ഒരു സെൻറ്റൻസ് അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. സെൻറ്റൻസ് അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് വഴി അതിൽ നിന്ന് ഒരു തിയറി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ഫോർമുല ഉണ്ടാക്കിയെടുക്കാനാണ് നോം ചോംസ്കി ശ്രമിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളത്. സോ ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് ദ ഫസ്റ്റ് പോയിന്റ്. And the next point we have to understand is that language is a very creative process. It is not a mere habit formation. But iതൊരു habit formation അല്ല. It is actually a very creative process. I might have told you in class about this experience of my friend with her niece. Her niece was only 2 years old. She hadn't started talking that much. And these two, my friend and her sister, brought the niece, took the niece outside. They went for shopping. They came back home. They made tea, and they forgot to give to the child, and they were drinking, and the child was looking from aunt to mother. Why are they not feeding me, she was thinking herself. And then she finally had to broke her silence because she didn't get her tea yet, she didn't get her snacks or refreshments. She said, Mammu, samartham kolla. So she has learned these three words earlier. Samartham means samarthyam, or brilliance, or something like that. Street smartness. Kolla means that's good, right? So she knew how to put these three words together and use the exact tone, use the correct tone, so that she can sarcastically put across her message to her mother and aunt, who forgot their responsibility to give this child a glass of tea. So, what happened there was entirely creative, because this child, a child that had turned 2 years old very recently, she never used a sentence like that before. She has never seen or heard any person use that sentence before. All she knew was these three words. Mammu. She calls her mother Mammu. And then Samartham. She has heard that word before being used by some other people. Like when a kitten or when a cat would come into their kitchen and snatch a fish, she would hear somebody says, Poochikinduru Samartham. So she had all these words in her mind, and when the correct situation, or when the correct context came, she put together these three words and gave it the exact tone to get across her message. So here we can say that, definitely using her example, we can definitely say that language is actually, the use of language is a creative process. It is not part of a habit formation. So that means that there is a mental reality underlying linguistic behavior. The way we use language, there is a mental reality underneath that. And language, our mind, our unconscious exactly, is structured like a language. That is what people like Lacan said. So there is another story about that. So there was this Lacan is a psychologist, psychiatrist, however you can call him. So he once got a patient. This patient had a problem. She used to get the same dream every night. Every night she would see the dream in which four bears are pulling her back using chains. She is trying to walk to the front, but these four bears are pulling her towards the back. Now she came to her doctor, and the doctor tried to find out what was wrong with this young lady, why she was having these recurrent dreams. So he tried to understand this lady's background. He understood that the lady actually didn't have a father figure in her in existence. So he understood that she has some problems with father figures and all, and it was bothering her. And then he tried to write this down. And then four bears, four bears. Okay, so he wrote down FOURBEARS, four bears. Then he started reading it very randomly, in a very rapidly, and it was like four bears. Four bears means four fathers. What this girl doesn't know about is, she doesn't know the whereabouts of her father and his family. So she doesn't know about her ancestors. So that feeling is actually pulling her back. It doesn't let her advance in life. So here what we understood is, the language, her mental problem was actually analyzed and found a cure for using language. So the analysis was made possible through language. So that is why unconscious is always structured like a language. So we can definitely see that there is a mental reality underlying linguistic behavior. Whenever we try to learn a language or use a language, there is a mental reality behind it. So, in order to describe a language, for the description of a language, it is primarily concerned with the speaker's knowledge of his language. That is his linguistic competence rather than performance. So, linguistic competence and linguistic performance are two terms we already discussed in one of the earlier classes. These are concepts by Noam Chomsky once again. Linguistic competence means the native speaker's knowledge about his own language. Linguistic performance is the way he writes or speaks using his understanding about his own native language. So that is linguistic competence and performance. Now, any description of a language, whenever we describe language, what the structuralists used to do is they used to describe linguistic performance. They would get like a sentence spoken by a person belonging to a particular group, or they would get like a book written by a particular person. So whatever we write and whatever we speak, it comes within the scope of linguistic performance. But what is linguistic competence? It is actually it is something which cannot be shown. It is in the mind of an individual speaker or individual learner. Whenever we start learning our language, our mother tongue, in our mind we have a set of rules and principles of how to use Malayalam. So especially since my language is Malayalam, നമ്മുടെ ഓരോരുത്തരുടെയും ലാംഗ്വേജ് മലയാളം ആയതുകൊണ്ട് ഇത് കേൾക്കുന്ന ഭൂരിഭാഗം ആൾക്കാരുടെ പേര് മലയാളം, നേറ്റീവ് ടങ്ങും മദർ ടങ്ങും മലയാളം ആയതുകൊണ്ട് നമ്മൾക്ക് ആരും പഠിപ്പിച്ചു തരേണ്ടതില്ല മലയാളത്തിലെ കറക്റ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള റിഥംസും പാറ്റേൺസും ഒക്കെ എങ്ങനെയാണ്, ഗ്രാമർ എങ്ങനെയാണെന്നുള്ള. അപ്പൊ ഈ ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് കോമ്പിറ്റൻസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന സംഭവം ആർക്കും തൊട്ട് കാണിക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല. Okay, so it is an abstract thing, linguistic competence. So ideally, if you are trying to describe language, you have to ideally describe linguistic competence, or it should be concerned with the speaker's knowledge of the language. But structuralists were always analyzing linguistic performance. That is the third point. Now, the fourth point is that whenever we say grammar should never be a mere classification of actual sentences produced by the native speakers, but a system of rules and principles internalized by the native speaker from his exposure to the language. So, what should grammar be? Grammar means you shouldn't just learn about nouns and verbs and pronouns and adjectives and all, and you shouldn't simply learn about different kinds of sentences and all. You should actually learn how or what kind of system of rules and principles are there in a language, and how these rules and principles are learned automatically by the native speaker without even trying to learn or without even needing any instruction. The native speaker is internalizing these system of rules and principles. What is this mental process behind this internalization of rules and principles? This internalization happens from his exposure to the language. So what happens when a child is born? He or she is constantly exposed to the usage of language in the family, in the society, when he goes out to play with the friends, when he goes to the school, when he watches TV, everywhere he is being exposed to this language continuously, and unknowingly he grasps certain rules and principles, and without knowing he is actually internalizing these rules. He is understanding and he is putting these rules to use. So that is actually grammar. Grammar is actually a system of rules and principles internalized by the native speaker. It is not a mere classification of actual sentences produced by the native speaker. So this is what transformational generative grammar attempts to explain. TGG is actually attempting to explain how the competence of a native speaker of a language can enable that speaker to produce an infinite number of sentences from a finite set. This is where the example I told you before comes into play. So my friend's niece, she actually didn't know a lot of sentences in Malayalam. She was still a baby. She's a toddler. She is still learning the language. So she knows only a very few sentences like Vishakunnu, I am hungry. She knows that. She knows a finite set of sentences. But using these, or a finite set of words and structures, but using these finite set of words she knows, or using this finite set of structures she knows, she has successfully created or produced an infinite number of sentences. How does the native speaker of a language, or a native speaker of Malayalam, for example, how does he produce this infinite number of sentences? On a daily basis, we speak hundreds of sentences to everybody around us. But we even speak sentences we never used before in our life. Today, I might have used some 2 or 3 sentences which I have never uttered before in my life. How did I gain that capability to produce that new sentence? That is what transformational generative grammar is trying to explain. ഞാൻ ഇതുവരെ സംസാരിച്ചിട്ടില്ലാത്ത ഒരു പുതിയ ഒരു സെൻറ്റൻസ്, ഒരു സ്റ്റേറ്റ്മെൻറ്റ് ഞാൻ എങ്ങനെയാണ് അത് സംസാരിച്ചു ഇന്ന്? എൻ്റെ മലയാളത്തിലുള്ള ഒരു ജ്ഞാനമുണ്ട്, ഇൻറ്റേർണലൈസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള റൂൾസും പ്രിൻസിപ്പിൾസും കാര്യങ്ങളും എൻ്റെ ഉള്ളിൽ തന്നെയുണ്ട്. ആ പ്രിൻസിപ്പിൾ യൂസ് ചെയ്ത് ഞാൻ ഇതുവരെ എൻ്റെ ഇത്രയും പ്രായത്തിൽ ഞാൻ ഉപയോഗിച്ചിട്ടില്ലാത്ത ഒരു സെൻറ്റൻസ് ഇന്ന് ഞാൻ പുതിയതായിട്ട് ഉപയോഗിച്ചു. ഒന്നല്ല, അതിൽ കൂടുതൽ സെൻറ്റൻസ് ഞാൻ ഉപയോഗിച്ച് കാണും. എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഒരു നേറ്റീവ് സ്പീക്കർ എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ ഞാൻ ഇത് ഉപയോഗിച്ചത്? ഈ ഒരു പോയിന്റിനെയാണ് TGG explain ചെയ്യാൻ attempt ചെയ്യുന്നത്. Okay, so structuralism, they always took into account only the form. They were always concerned only with the form. But transformational generative grammar, TG grammar, it was concerned with the relation between form and meaning. They also took into consideration this thing called meaning. So they took into consideration the relation between form and meaning. So meaning is very crucial. So the relationship between meaning and form is very crucial in the generation of sentences that are both grammatical and meaningful. So whatever my friend's niece told, that was grammatical and meaningful. She put across a very grammatical sentence like mammu, samartham, kolla. Even though samarthyam was actually, she couldn't pronounce that correctly, she pronounced it as samartham. It was very grammatical. She successfully got the message across to her mother and aunt, and it was also very meaningful. She used the right tone, intonation and stress, and everything was correct. So how did this happen? So she took into consideration both the form and the meaning of these words. She collected the meanings of these words somehow. She put together in the exact form she wanted. How is this possible? What is the mental process behind this generation of a new sentence? That is what transformational generative grammar is trying to understand. So the first thing we have to understand is about the structure of a sentence. So thus far we have been learning about structure. That is what we did with IC analysis and PSG. But we learned only about one kind of structure. What we fail to understand that is that for every sentence that comes out of our mouth, and for every sentence that you write down on your book, it has two kinds of structure: deep structure and surface structure. So any kind of grammar which is adequate, it must provide for facts of the language that is productive, complex and arbitrary. So we are trying to explain the productive nature of language in this class, how using very few number of words we can produce many sentences. That is an example of productivity. And we know that language is complex. And we also know that language is arbitrary. A table is called a table without any reason. It could have been named chair. The word table had no relation to the object table. So that is arbitrariness of language. So any adequate grammar, it must provide why or how language is productive, complex and arbitrary. It should also establish the relationship of various sentences, and it should account for the two kinds of structure of sentences, that is deep structure and surface structure. So we are trying to say that transformational generative grammar is an adequate kind of grammar because it establishes the relationship between various kinds of various sentences. It accounts for deep structure and surface structure of sentences. So we will come to deep structure and surface structure shortly. So there are other merits of transformational generative grammar. It shows the functions of various parts of sentence. That is what we learned with IC analysis and PSG. IC analysis and PSG ലും നമ്മൾ ചെയ്തത് അത് തന്നെയാണ്. We learned about noun phrase and verb phrase, and we learned about determiner, noun, auxiliary, and all that prepositional phrase and all that. So these are various parts of a sentence. And we also learned about their interrelatedness within the sentence. We learned, so TG grammar also shows us how various parts of a sentence are related to each other. But TG grammar does something which PSG and IC analysis did not do. It shows the relationship between different types of sentences. That was one of the inadequacies or limitations of PSG and IC analysis. It failed to show inter-sentence relationships. It failed to show the relationship between active and passive sentences, failed to show the relationship between interrogative sentences and statements, negative sentences and positive sentences. All these relationships were unaccounted by PSG and IC analysis. But that is where TGG is a better model of grammar. So first let us look at kernel sentence. Kernel sentence is called the basic sentence. There are 4 requirements for a sentence to be a kernel sentence. These 4 requirements are: it should be simple. It should be a simple sentence. It should not be a complex or a compound sentence. Second is, it should be an assertive sentence. It should not be a negative sentence. It should be a positive or an assertive sentence. Third requirement is, it should be a declarative sentence. It shouldn't be an interrogative or imperative sentence. It should be a statement. It should be declarative sentence. And the fourth requirement is that it should be in active voice. It should not be a passive voice sentence. It should be in active form. So these are the 4 requirements for a kernel sentence. So a kernel sentence is simple, assertive, declarative, and active. So simple, assertive, declarative, active sentences are called kernel sentences. These are some examples of kernel sentences. Like John is playing football. It is simple. It is assertive. It is declarative. And it is active. And then I wrote a letter. This sentence is also, it also fulfills all these categories. And you spoke the truth. That again fulfills these criteria. So these 3 are examples of basic sentences or kernel sentences. So when I say deep structure, that is actually kernel sentence. All kernel sentences are deep structure sentences. Okay, so all kernel sentences are deep structure sentences. Let us look at some non-kernel sentences. Is John playing football? It is an interrogative sentence. It's a question. So it is not a kernel sentence. So this is an example of a surface structure sentence. John is not playing football. It is a negative sentence. It is not assertive because there is a word not here. So that is why it is not a kernel sentence. It's a non-kernel sentence. A letter was written by me. It's not in active voice. It is in passive voice. Again, you spoke the truth when you were forced. That is a complex sentence and hence a non-kernel sentence. You spoke the truth but told a new story. It is a compound sentence because there is a but here. We have 2 complete sentences joined together by a conjunction. So that is a compound sentence and hence a non-kernel sentence. So here you understood the difference between a kernel sentence and a non-kernel sentence. So when we speak, we utter a lot of non-kernel sentences. And we have to understand that non-kernel sentences are actually surface structure sentences. What the structure we actually know from analyzing this sentence, it will be the surface structure. But we have to understand the basic form of this sentence. The basic form or kernel form of this sentence will be the deep structure of this sentence. ഇപ്പൊ ഇസ് ജോൺ പ്ലേയിങ് ഫുട്ബോൾ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സെന്റൻസിന് ഒരു സർഫസ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ മാത്രമേ ഉള്ളൂ. അപ്പൊ ഇതിന്റെ ഡീപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ മനസ്സിലാക്കണമെങ്കിൽ ഇതിന്റെ ഉള്ളിൽ കിടക്കുന്ന ഒരു സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഉണ്ട്, ഉള്ളിൽ ഒളിഞ്ഞു കിടക്കുന്ന ഒരു സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഉണ്ട്. സോ ഡീപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഇസ് ആക്ച്വലി ഹിഡൻ വിത്തിൻ ദിസ് സെന്റൻസ്. യു കാൺട്ട് സീ ഇറ്റ് ഇൻ ഫസ്റ്റ് ഗ്ലാൻസ്. അപ്പൊ ഈ ഒരു സെന്റൻസിന്റെ ഡീപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ മനസ്സിലാക്കണമെങ്കിൽ ആദ്യം നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കിട്ടുന്ന നോൺ കേർണൽ സെന്റൻസ് ഒരു കേർണൽ സെന്റൻസ് ആക്കി കൺവേർട്ട് ചെയ്യണം. എങ്കിൽ മാത്രമേ നമുക്ക് അതിന്റെ ഡീപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ കഴിയുള്ളൂ. സോ ടു അണ്ടർസ്റ്റാൻഡ് ദ ഡീപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഓഫ് എ സെന്റൻസ് യു വിൽ ഹാവ് ടു മെന്റലി turn a non-kernel sentence into a kernel sentence, and therein you will understand the hidden deep structure of a sentence. So there you go. Any sentence like this, any non-kernel sentence will have a surface structure and a hidden deep structure. So the deep structure will be a basic or a kernel sentence, and kernel sentence is simple, assertive, declarative and active in form. So now let us look at the two elements in transformational generative grammar, that is the transformational and generative elements. So we already established that the kernel sentence comprises the deep structure of any utterance. So utterance means any kind of communicative element that comes out of our mouth. It qualifies as utterance. Sometimes an utterance will only be a simple sound like, did you take a shower? No. It can be a simple sound or a simple sentence or a word. Sometimes it can be a sentence or a phrase. Sometimes it can actually go on for minutes. It can be a paragraph, or it can actually comprise a whole book. That is what utterance is. Utterance doesn't have a definite length. So a kernel sentence, it comprises the deep structure of any utterance. We already established that. If we want to know the deep structure of a sentence, just look at the kernel sentence. Just convert it to the kernel sentence. So what happens to deep structure? Originally we have a kernel sentence, or what we call a deep structure. And using this deep structure, using this kernel sentence, we are able to produce infinite number of sentences. How is this possible? That is where transformational element comes into play. So to the deep structure of a sentence, we apply a number of transformational rules. When I say we, I mean the native speaker. And how does he know the transformational rules? Because he has already internalized a system of rules and principles about his own language unknowingly. Without knowing, he has already learned all the rules and principles of his language. And so he or he applies a number of transformational rules to this deep structure. And that is how they succeed in generating an infinite number of sentences. So that is possible by virtue of the linguistic competence of the native speaker. So this understanding of the system of rules and principles, that is called the linguistic competence. And using this linguistic competence, our native speaker applies a number of transformational rules to deep structure, and thus successfully generates an infinite number of sentences. For example, let us look at this sentence, where did you go yesterday? So the kernel sentence of this question, this sentence is, you went somewhere yesterday. So that is the kernel sentence, you went somewhere yesterday. So to this deep structure or to this kernel sentence, certain transformational rules are applied. Certain transformational rules are applied, and we know this transformational rules because we have linguistic competence. And then we get the end product. After all the transformations are made, the end product is, where did you go yesterday? So this is the surface structure. Deep structure is, you went somewhere yesterday. Surface structure is, where did you go yesterday? So that is what happens. That is where transformational rules are applied. That is a transformational element. An infinite number of sentences are generated. That is the generative element of TG grammar. So using transformational generative grammar, there are many benefits or merits of TG grammar over PSG and IC analysis. One of the merits is that ambiguities can be resolved using TG grammar. That was a major problem with IC analysis and PSG. But when it comes to TGG, we can certainly solve some ambiguities. For example, when you look at interrelatedness of sentences, we already proved that TG grammar can account to show the interrelated relations of sentences, but it can also explain ambiguities between sentences that appear identical but are transforms of different kernels. Let me just explain this using a simple example. For example, this sentence, flying planes can be dangerous. It is an ambiguous sentence. It has two meanings. The first meaning is the act of flying planes. It can be dangerous. Second meaning is that the planes that fly, they can be dangerous. അപ്പോൾ രണ്ട് അർത്ഥങ്ങളുണ്ട് ഈ സെന്റൻസിന്. ഇതൊരു ആംബിഗ്വസ് സെന്റൻസ് ആണ്. വിമാനം പറത്തുന്നത് അപകടകരമാണ് എന്നും വരും, പറക്കുന്ന വിമാനങ്ങൾ അപകടകരമാണ് എന്നും വരും. But how can we resolve this ambiguity? If you use IC analysis or PSG, we cannot explain the two different meanings of this sentence. But when we apply TG grammar and when we arrive at the deep structure of these two different meanings are different. അപ്പോൾ ഈ രണ്ട് മീനിങ്സ് ഉണ്ടെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു. ഈ രണ്ട് മീനിങ്സിനും ഒരു സർഫസ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ ആണെങ്കിലും രണ്ട് ഡീപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ ആണ്. സോ ദീസ് two different meanings have one surface structure and two deep structures. For example, the first instance, that is, some people fly planes. This can be dangerous. That is, the act of flying planes can be dangerous. അതാണ് ഞാൻ ആദ്യം പറഞ്ഞത്. വിമാനം പറത്തുന്നത് അപകടകരമാണ് എന്നാണ് ഞാൻ ആദ്യം പറഞ്ഞത്. The act of flying planes can be dangerous. Let us look at that meaning. It has two kernel sentences. Some people fly planes. This can be dangerous. So you got one meaning. And the second meaning is planes fly. They can be dangerous. So here, what is dangerous is the planes. Here, what is dangerous is the activity of flying planes. So here you might have understood now how this ambiguity about this sentence, which had one surface structure and two deep structures, it can be resolved by analyzing the sentence using TG grammar and arriving at its two different deep structures. ഈ ഡീപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ മനസ്സിലാക്കി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഈ സെന്റൻസിന്റെ ആംബിഗ്വിറ്റി നമുക്ക് ഈസിലി സോൾവ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. അവിടെയാണ് ട്രാൻസ്ഫോർമേഷണൽ ജനറേറ്റീവ് ഗ്രാമർ നമ്മളെ ഹെൽപ്പ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. So let us see how transformational generative grammar works. First of all, a kernel sentence. You have to take a kernel sentence and you have to analyze it using phrase structure rules. Using phrase structure rules, a kernel sentence has to be analyzed. And after the analysis, you have to write the kernel sentence in the form of a string. ഒരു string ആയിട്ട് എഴുതുക. And the second step is, to the string, you have to apply transformational rules. And after applying transformational rules, you arrive at the surface structure. So first you had a deep structure. To the deep structure, you applied phrase structure rules. After that, after writing it in a string, you apply transformational rules. First you apply PS rules, then you apply T rules. And now you have arrived at the surface structure. At this level, you apply morphophonemic rules. And by applying morphophonemic rules, you substitute labels with real words. So these are the three kinds of rules are applied in TGG. PS rules, T rules, and morphophonemic rules. Let us look at an example, then you will understand it better. Okay, so this is an example. So here I have a sentence, is he sleeping? Is this a kernel sentence? No, because it is a question. It is an interrogative sentence. So it is actually a surface structure sentence. is he sleeping? Is he sleeping is a surface structure sentence. It is a non-kernel sentence. It is an interrogative sentence. First thing you have to do is, what we are trying to understand is, how did we generate this sentence, is he sleeping? Is he sleeping എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സെന്റൻസ് എങ്ങനെ ഉണ്ടായി? അപ്പോൾ അതാണ് നമ്മൾ ശരിക്കും പറഞ്ഞാൽ അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്. അതാണ് നമ്മൾ മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്. ഈസ് ഹി സ്ലീപ്പിംഗ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സെന്റൻസ് എങ്ങനെ ഉണ്ടായി? So for that, first we convert it into its kernel form. The kernel form is he is sleeping. It is a kernel form. It is not a question. It is a statement. It is active. It is declarative. So all of it actually, it is affirmative. So all the criteria fits here. First, we convert it into kernel sentence. Now we have to do analysis of this kernel sentence. So let's do the analysis. He is he here also. Now is the present of be. Is the present of be. Now what we are doing here is we are applying PS rules and we are writing it in the form of a string. അപ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ നമ്മൾ യൂസ് ചെയ്തത് ഫ്രേസ് സ്ട്രക്ചർ റൂൾസ് യൂസ് ചെയ്ത് നമ്മൾ ഇതൊരു സ്ട്രിങ്ങിന്റെ രൂപത്തിൽ എഴുതുകയാണ് ഇവിടെ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പോൾ ഹി ആൻഡ് ദെൻ പ്രസന്റ് ഓഫ് ബി, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ്. Okay, and sleeping is sleep plus ing, but when we write it in the form of a string, always ing comes first. Ing means progressive of sleep, right? Ing sleep. So he, present of be, ing of sleep. That is the analysis. Then let's apply a T rule. Now we have applied a PS rule here. In this step we applied a phrase structure rule. Now let's apply a transformational rule or T rule. So the T rule we are going to use here is called the interrogative rule. So how to make a sentence from this statement? He is sleeping. How to make a sentence? Simple. It is actually quite simple. This is should go to the beginning of the sentence. It should become is he sleeping. So he and is should change positions. So that is what is happening here. Interrogative rule വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് we bring the present of be from inside the sentence to the first of this, to the initial part of the sentence. So present of be comes to the front. Then we put he and then we put ing sleep. I hope you understood this particular rule. And then we apply another T rule, another transformational rule. This rule is called the affix switch rule. Here we have to switch the affixes. For example, first we have to, there is a present of be. So we have to switch the position of that. Instead of present of be, we have to put it as be and present. What is the present form of be? So it is be, we know that. And it is present. But we have to understand if it is or are. If we should use is or are. ഇവിടെ be എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ആ സംഭവത്തിന്റെ പ്രസന്റ് ടെൻസ് ആണ് യൂസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടതെന്ന് നമുക്ക് മനസ്സിലായി. പക്ഷെ രണ്ട് പ്രസന്റ് ടെൻസ് ഫോംസ് ഉണ്ട്, is ഉണ്ട്, are ഉണ്ട്. ഇതിൽ ഏതാണ് നമുക്ക് ഇവിടെ യൂസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടതെന്ന് നമുക്ക് അറിയത്തില്ല. അപ്പം നമ്മൾ അടുത്ത എലമെന്റ് നോക്കണം. നെക്സ്റ്റ് എലമെന്റ് is he. He is singular form. That means the present tense form we use of be is. So we put it as is. Then again ing plus sleep. We switch the positions of that. Sleep plus ing എന്നാക്കി. So now we applied one PS rule here, two T rules in these two steps, and finally we apply morphophonemic rules. And be the present tense എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് is. Present tense of be here, because this is singular, is. And then he comes here, and sleep plus ing is sleeping. This is a very simple example of how to do a transformational analysis, transformational generative grammar analysis. I will be doing more examples for people who want to learn more, but this much is sufficient for graduate level understanding. So now let's try and understand what a generative grammar is. Formally, a generative grammar is defined as one that is fully explicit, one that is very clear and concise. there is no confusion at the end of learning a generative grammar. There shouldn't be any confusions or ambiguities. So it is a finite set of rules that can be applied to generate all those and only those sentences that are grammatical and meaningful in a given language. So any generative grammar will have a set of rules. ഓരോ ജനറേറ്റീവ് ഗ്രാമറിനും ഒരു ഫൈനൈറ്റ് സെറ്റ് ഓഫ് റൂൾസ് ആണ്. ഈ റൂൾസ് യൂസ് ചെയ്തിട്ട് വി ക്യാൻ ആക്ച്വലി ഫോം ഇൻഫിനിറ്റ് നമ്പർ ഓഫ് വി ക്യാൻ ജനറേറ്റ് ഇൻഫിനിറ്റ് നമ്പർ ഓഫ് സെൻറ്റൻസസ് ആൻഡ് ദീസ് സെൻറ്റൻസസ് വിൽ ബി ഗ്രമാറ്റിക്കൽ ആൻഡ് മീനിങ്ഫുൾ. So these are the two important quotients of a generative grammar. Whatever sentence we produce using our understanding about the rules, it has to be grammatical and meaningful. Form is important and meaning is important, and the relationship between form and meaning is also essential. So that brings us to the end of today's class. I hope this was beneficial for you. You might have to go through this video a couple of times and let me know in comments about what you find difficult so I can do a follow-up video of this. So this much is actually sufficient for a graduate level understanding, and for advanced learners I will be making a video shortly. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Bye.